Betrayed, broken, and left for dead, John awakens with scars that tell a story of unimaginable pain, but his enemies made one fatal mistake: they didn't finish the job. Now, with nothing to lose, he's about to show them the price of betrayal. Before tragedy changed everything, John Valentino was a man of ambition and precision. Known for his sharp intellect and commanding presence in the world of finance, he had carved out a stellar career by navigating and manipulating currency markets for elite clients, including influential hedge funds. His success brought him immense wealth and clout, but it also made him enemies, some of whom were watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. To the outside world, John seemed to have it all. His professional achievements were mirrored by what appeared to be a picture-perfect marriage to his wife, Eleanor. Yet, beneath the surface of their polished life, cracks were forming, and a deep betrayal was lurking, ready to shatter his world. The event that turned John's life upside down wasn't an ordinary crime. It was a meticulously planned betrayal, orchestrated by people he had trusted implicitly. On a seemingly uneventful August morning, after a routine start to his day, John stepped into the elevator of his office building. Two unfamiliar men joined him, their casual demeanor masking their true intentions. Moments later, their conversation took a sinister turn. Without warning, the men attacked. As John's vision blurred and his consciousness began to fade, his last thought was a chilling realization: he had been set up. But by then, it was too late. "Mr. Doe," a voice called out, faint at first but gradually becoming louder. Sharp pain shot through his hand as he became aware of a crushing sensation on his index finger. Despite the agony, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't fight against the weight pressing him down. "You're in the hospital, John," the voice came again, more distinct this time. "I need to run a few tests, and then you can rest." Hospital? Sleep? John struggled to open his eyes. A sliver of light pierced his vision before retreating into darkness. "Try again," the voice urged gently. He forced his eyes open again, only for a searing brightness to stab at his senses. "Can you squeeze my hands?" the voice prompted. John felt pressure on his palms and willed himself to respond. "Good. Now wiggle your toes," the voice continued. A sharp scrape against his foot made him flinch. "Excellent. You're improving, Mr. Doe. Now, rest again." Darkness enveloped him once more. When John regained awareness, it felt like emerging from a crushing weight. He struggled to orient himself, sensing the cool air from a fan brushing against his skin. His legs twitched as though walking, but he wasn't moving. Was he? The faint beeping of a machine sounded behind him, joined by soft buzzes to his right. Then came a persistent chime. He tried to turn his head, only to trigger an alarm that blared near his feet. Confused and disoriented, his thoughts raced. "What's happening?" "Hey there, mate," a friendly voice said. The sound of a chair scraping the floor followed, and a hand rested gently on his shoulder. "You're waking up after a long time. You've been in a coma," the voice explained. Something tugged at John's arm, and the rhythmic beeping stopped. The silence that followed was unsettling, yet a glimmer of clarity began to pierce through the fog in his mind. "I'm Brian, one of the nurses taking care of you," the man said gently, his voice calm and reassuring. John tried to respond, but no sound came out. His throat felt tight, and he panicked for a moment. "You can't talk yet," Brian explained, noticing the struggle. "There's a tracheostomy tube in your neck to help you breathe. You're on a ventilator, but we're hoping to remove it soon." A cool sensation brushed against his skin as Brian wiped a damp cloth over his right eye and cheek. "What's wrong with my face?" John wondered silently. His thoughts raced as he realized he couldn't feel anything on the left side. "Try to open your eyes, John," Brian encouraged, his tone steady. "I'll dim the lights to make it easier. Give it a try." John concentrated, blinking slowly. A blurry light came into view, hazy and unfocused. The cloth returned, gently wiping again, and his vision began to clear. "I'm just cleaning the ointment from your eye after the drops," Brian explained, his voice patient as he wiped once more. Gradually, the room came into focus. John's gaze settled on the figure standing over him, a man with long brown hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and a stethoscope draped over dark blue scrubs. "Blink a few more times," Brian urged. "It'll help." John did as he was told, and Brian's features sharpened. The nurse smiled warmly, holding a small red flashlight. "Welcome back, buddy. It's been a long journey," he said with a grin. "Now, I'm just going to check your eyes, okay?" The flashlight's beam was bright but not overwhelming as Brian examined him. "Great. Now for the next part," Brian said, lowering the light. "Can you squeeze my fingers?" John focused and managed to squeeze. "Good. Now try wiggling your toes." John wiggled them slightly, feeling a flicker of control returning to his body. "All right," Brian said, tapping on a tablet. "We've been calling you JN because we don't know your real name. You've been responding to it, though. Is your name John?" Nod if yes, or shake your head if no. John nodded weakly. 2 points for the red team. Brian joked, laughing as he updated his tablet. "You're in the ICU at St. Joe's. You've been here for over a month. It's Wednesday, September 29, 2021. John struggled to process the information. A month? The weight of it pressed against his already foggy mind. "If you look by the door, you'll see a whiteboard," Brian continued, pointing toward it. "It has today's date and the names of your doctor and the staff working with you." John's eyes followed the direction of Brian's gesture, his mind grappling with the reality of his situation as fragments of awareness slowly pieced together. "I'm Brian," the nurse said with a calm smile. "Dr. Bellin is your intensivist, MA is your medical assistant, and RT is your respiratory therapist." He moved back to the bedside, holding up a clear plastic tube. "It's 2 a.m., the middle of the night shift," Brian added. "I'm going to use this suction catheter to clear the spit from the back of your mouth." John heard a slurping sound but barely felt anything. "There are a few other things you should know," Brian continued. "You have a tracheostomy tube in your neck to help you breathe, an NG tube going into your stomach for feeding, and a catheter in your bladder. So, if you feel like you need to pee." John did, in fact, feel that way. "Don't worry," Brian reassured him. "Your urine's going into a bag by your bed." Brian gestured to John's wrists, which were loosely secured with soft restraints. "We've tied your wrists to prevent you from pulling anything out while you're still medicated. Once you're off the ventilator, we'll remove them, if you can promise not to tug at anything." His voice softened. "Are you in pain? If so, squeeze my hand." John shrugged slightly, unsure if what he felt could be described as pain or simply discomfort. "Okay," Brian said, nodding. "We want to keep you comfortable, but not too sedated." He pointed at a row of medical devices near the bed. "You're on quite a few medications right now, but we'll reduce them as soon as it's safe." None of it made much sense to John, whose foggy mind struggled to process the flood of information. He let his gaze drift to the ceiling as exhaustion pulled him back into sleep. But rest didn't bring peace. His dreams were chaotic and terrifying, filled with fragmented images of pain and fear that dissolved as quickly as they formed. John woke with a start, gasping for air. The sound of alarms blaring to his left filled the room. His chest heaved as he coughed, and sharp pain tore through his throat and ribs. His left side was still bandaged, the dull ache adding to his confusion. "Easy, easy," a gentle female voice soothed. A blonde woman leaned into view, her presence calm and composed. "I'm Sarah, your respiratory therapist," she said. "We're weaning you off the ventilator. Are you in pain?" John nodded weakly, the sharp ache in his face suddenly becoming more pronounced. He noticed his legs moving slightly, guided by robotic attachments that made them walk in place, though he remained lying down. It was disorienting, and he could feel his breathing shallow as he tried to process his strange, waking reality. "I'll get your nurse," Sarah said gently before disappearing from the room. Later, John woke feeling more alert. The ventilator had been replaced with a misting blue hose, allowing him to breathe more comfortably. His bed was propped up higher, and he noticed that the robotic devices once guiding his legs were now gone. His thoughts felt clearer, no longer as weighed down by the fog that had clouded his mind. The morning was a whirlwind of activity. Doctors, nurses, and therapists moved in and out of his room, each attending to different aspects of his care. John was transferred to another part of the hospital for scans, the staff praising his progress along the way, though much of their medical jargon remained a mystery to him. With their assistance, he managed to sit in a chair and even stand briefly, milestones he hadn't expected to reach so soon. Despite everything, the doctors reassured him that his brain was intact, even though he had suffered a traumatic brain injury, TBI. One of them commented that the fractures in his skull had ironically prevented his brain from herniating during the swelling, a grim but fortunate detail. For John, the highlight of the day came when they removed his catheter, allowing him to urinate on his own for the first time. Simple pleasures, he thought, a small comfort amid the overwhelming circumstances. A few days later, John woke to an unfamiliar scene. Several strangers in dark suits stood gathered around his bed. They had serious expressions, and their presence filled the room with tension. One of them, a woman with neatly tied back hair and a stern demeanor, stepped forward holding a tablet. "Mr. Doe," she began, her tone formal and precise. "You've been hospitalized for nearly 2 months." John tried to respond but couldn't find the words. Instead, he gestured for something to write with, but she continued, pausing briefly to meet his eyes. "We don't know exactly how you were injured," she explained. "Passers-by found you and assumed you were dead after suffering a severe trauma." She held up photos taken upon his admission to the ER, gruesome and raw. John turned his head to look, both horrified and compelled to see what had happened to him. "The ambulance took you to the nearest hospital for what was expected to be a post-mortem declaration," she continued, "but they discovered you were barely clinging to life." The woman took a deep breath before delivering the next piece of news. "Your injuries are extensive. You've sustained a severe head injury, numerous fractures I can't even begin to list, and a significant spinal cord injury that has resulted in at least partial paralysis on your left side." John's chest tightened as she went on. "Your left eye was destroyed, along with much of the surrounding tissue and bone," she added. "Additionally, your reproductive organs have suffered extensive damage, and the prognosis there remains uncertain." Her words hung in the air, each one landing like a blow. John stared at the ceiling, trying to process the weight of it all. His body was battered, broken in ways he couldn't yet comprehend, and his life, once so firmly in his control, now felt impossibly distant. "If your right testicle is still functional." The words lingered, heavy and overwhelming. John's mind struggled to keep pace with the relentless cascade of information. Until now, no one had laid out the full extent of his injuries, and the realization left him feeling hollow. The group of strangers standing near his bed exchanged glances. One of them, a young man who appeared nervous, stepped forward, clutching a tablet. "Mr. Doe," the man began, his voice faltering. "Before we proceed, we need you to sign some forms." He handed the tablet to John, who squinted at the small print filling the screen. The text seemed to swim before his eyes, overwhelming in both size and significance. "You can read it all, of course," the man added with a weak chuckle, "but we'd all be old and gray by the time you're done." The attempt at humor fell flat, and the young man quickly cleared his throat. "Your first signature authorizes us to provide treatment, access your records, and act on your behalf in legal and medical matters. I should mention, there are no guarantees." John's grip on the tablet tightened as he glanced up, still uncertain. His thoughts felt muddy, his ability to make sense of the situation clouded by exhaustion and disbelief. Another man in the group quietly cleared his throat, earning a sharp frown from the doctor standing at the head of the group, Dr. Malcolm. "If I may, sir," the man said gently, before turning to John. "Mr. Doe, I should also mention that by volunteering for our experimental program, all of your financial liabilities will be forgiven, regardless of the outcome." John looked back at Dr. Malcolm, searching for some sign of confirmation. The doctor gave him a subtle nod, his expression calm but unreadable. Taking a deep breath, John lifted the tablet and scrawled his signature on the screen. His hand trembled slightly as he passed the device back, knowing he was agreeing to something he didn't fully understand. The group dispersed slightly, and a new figure stepped forward, Dr. Willoughby. She gestured to a nearby monitor displaying a series of scans. "The cranial injuries you sustained were extensive," she began, pointing to the images. "They included a low Fort 3 fracture to your facial structure and traumatic damage to your left orbital socket. Unfortunately, your left eye and optic nerve are beyond repair." John stared at the screen, the scans meaningless to him. "You also experienced right testicular torsion," she continued, her tone clinical but not unkind. "This resulted in the loss of the organ. Additionally, you suffered multiple lung contusions, several broken ribs, and a range of other fractures." The words felt surreal, as though he were being cast as a character in some bizarre sci-fi experiment. John barely registered the rest of Dr. Willoughby's explanation, his thoughts snagged on the sheer magnitude of what had happened to him. He felt less like a patient and more like a subject, an entity pieced together by medical intervention, waiting to see if he could endure what was yet to come. She paused, her intense gaze locking onto his. "Tomorrow, we'll begin the next phase of your treatment," she said firmly. "We'll be correcting the alignment of your spinal vertebrae and addressing the nerve pathways contributing to the paralysis on your left side." John cleared his throat, testing his voice for the first time. It came out raspy but audible. "How long will that take?" he asked, his words slow and deliberate. "It's a routine procedure," she replied matter-of-factly. "You should be back in your room by noon. By then, we'll have a clearer idea of your deficits on the left side." Before John could respond, a loud clicking noise shattered the quiet. A sudden, searing pain tore through his head, followed by a blinding flash of white light. "Johnny," a voice sang mockingly, pulling him into the void. "Hey, Johnny." The sharp sting of ammonia under his nose jolted him back to consciousness. His head throbbed, his eyes burned with tears, and he moaned softly, instinctively trying to move. But he couldn't. "There he is," the same voice said, smooth and mocking. As his vision cleared, John found himself staring up at a middle-aged man with sharp, angular features, a hawk-like face that seemed to leer at him. The man's suit was pristine, a tailored three-piece that radiated menace. "Welcome back, Johnny," the man said, a cruel smile spreading across his lips. John's chest tightened with dread as he realized where he was. "You see, Johnny, it's like this," the man continued, pacing slowly in front of him. "You've been working hard, manipulating currency markets for a colleague of mine." He stopped suddenly, leaning in close, his grin widening. "And you've done a fantastic job." The man held up a device, a sleek, metallic instrument that looked disturbingly like a cattle prod. He waved it in front of John's face, letting the tension linger. "But," he said, his voice dropping, "I also know you've been siphoning off some of this colleague's capital into a nice, discreet offshore account, supposedly to protect it from prying eyes." A cold sweat broke out across John's body. His mind raced, piecing together the events that had led him here. The man straightened and began pacing again. "You thought you could outsmart us, Johnny. That was your first mistake." John's pulse quickened as he remembered Eleanor, his wife. Just shy of their first anniversary, she had been waiting for him at home so they could celebrate. His last conversation with her echoed in his mind, the sound of her voice a stark contrast to the nightmare unfolding now. They must have grabbed her right after I left the office, John thought, panic rising. Summoning what little strength he had, he struggled against the two thugs holding him tightly. "What have you done to her?" he demanded, his voice hoarse but filled with desperate fury. The man stopped pacing, turning back to John with a smile that sent chills down his spine. "Eleanor," he said, savoring the name. "Ah, Johnny, you'll find out soon enough." "I swear," John managed to gasp. Lenny erupted into laughter, a guttural sound that filled the room as if he had just heard the punchline of the world's cruelest joke. "What have I done?" Lenny howled between bursts of laughter. "Man, you're a real idiot." Behind him, more laughter echoed, cruel and mocking. John's head snapped toward the sound, and his heart dropped as his captors stepped aside to reveal Eleanor. "This lady you married," Lenny said, wrapping an arm possessively around her waist, pulling her close. "She's my girl." John's world tilted as he watched in stunned disbelief. The two locked lips in front of him, their kiss brazen and passionate, as though they were performing on a stage meant to humiliate him. Fury and despair warred inside him, leaving his legs weak beneath the firm grip of the men holding him. How could this be?" he stammered, his voice breaking. "I bet you didn't know I was with her right before she walked down the aisle to you," Lenny sneered, his grin widening. "We've been at it since she was sneaking out of her mom's house. Isn't that right, Ellie?" Eleanor responded with a smirk, leaning into Lenny as if to affirm his every word. John's head dropped, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical pain he'd endured. Eleanor stepped closer, tilting his chin up with an icy, cruel touch. For a moment, he thought he saw a trace of the woman he had loved, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She released his chin, her hand moving lower until her nails dug into his groin, sharp and unrelenting. The pain was searing, and John cried out, his body jerking involuntarily. "Give us the account numbers and the codes," she shrieked, her face inches from his. "Whoa, easy there, sweetheart," Lenny said, laughing as he grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "We're saving the jewels for last." He turned to her, a sly grin spreading across his face as he began unfastening his trousers. "But if you're so eager to go after his manhood, why not show him what you've got? Don't hurt her." John pleaded desperately, his voice raw with anguish. Lenny sneered at him, shaking his head. "Oh, Johnny, you still don't get it, do you?" He gestured toward Eleanor, who stood cool and composed, a stark contrast to the woman John had once cherished. "She's been in on this from the start," Lenny said with a chuckle. "She's not the one suffering here, you are." John's eyes locked onto Eleanor's, searching for even the faintest glimmer of the love they once shared. But all he found was cold detachment. "Tell him, Ellie," Lenny ordered. Eleanor smiled, a slow, venomous curl of her lips. "It's true, Johnny," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "I never loved you. This was always about the money. Just give him what he wants and make it easier on yourself." The last fragile threads of hope unraveled within John, leaving only a hollow emptiness behind. He doubled over as fresh pain coursed through his body, but this time, something inside him shifted. It wasn't defeat. It was rage, a burning ember that refused to be extinguished. With a sudden burst of desperation, John raised his bound hands and drove them into Lenny's groin with every ounce of strength he had left. Lenny's eyes widened as a strangled scream erupted from him. He stumbled back, clutching himself in pain. For the first time, a flicker of satisfaction sparked within John. He wasn't finished, not yet. "I won't let you win," John muttered, his voice low but firm, a flicker of defiance sparking in his battered body. Lenny, clutching himself in pain and seething with rage, glared at him, but John's mind had already begun to drift to another time, a better, quieter moment. In his ongoing recovery, Monique had become a constant presence in his life. As his physical therapist, she was by his side daily, helping him regain strength and mobility. Whether guiding him through ambulation exercises or working on resistance training, she also assisted with tasks that had once seemed routine: dressing, cooking, eating, washing, and even shaving. She wasn't just practical, she was skilled. As his massage therapist, she worked diligently to help him regain control over finer motor skills, typing, texting, even using a remote. John's feelings toward her had become a complex mix of admiration and frustration. No matter how irritated or even abusive he became, Monique remained an unwavering source of positivity, meeting his anger with cheerful resilience. Her success was undeniable. Bit by bit, John's body and independence were returning, and while it infuriated him to feel so dependent on someone, he couldn't help but respect her determination. One evening, as Monique worked with him, she gave him a coy smile, her tone teasing but kind. "They wanted you to wait until tomorrow to express yourself, but I convinced them we could make it happen sooner." She lifted a small packet from the tray beside the bed. John blinked, speechless, as Monique stood and began untying her robe. The garment slipped from her shoulders, falling open to reveal her flawless form. His eyes followed her every movement, drinking in the sight of her. She was beautiful, stunning in a way he had noticed before but never dared to imagine beyond admiration. Monique returned to the bed, leaning in close to cradle his scarred face with her soft hands. She kissed him gently, and John's mind raced. He had admired her for so long but never thought this moment was possible. Here she was, offering more than care or duty. She was bringing him back to life, not just physically but emotionally. In her, John found a connection he hadn't felt since his life had been shattered. Their relationship began to deepen, intertwining physical rehabilitation with emotional support. Monique stood by him through his darkest moments, guiding him when he faltered and lending him strength when he felt weak. At the same time, John underwent intense psychological counseling, attempting to piece together his fragmented memories and confront the trauma he had endured. Each day brought more clarity, though with it came the resurgence of painful images from the violence he had suffered. Through it all, Monique was there, helping him navigate the chaos within and rebuilding what he thought had been lost forever. The memories he had tried to suppress clawed their way back to the surface, tormenting John nightly. Vivid nightmares invaded his sleep, filled with the violence and betrayal he had endured. No amount of physical therapy or counseling seemed to banish them completely. In one of his therapy sessions, the doctors presented him with a new option, a cutting-edge experimental device that could restore a semblance of sight. They explained the pros and cons carefully, their tones both cautious and optimistic. One doctor handed him a model of the device and pointed out how it would connect to his remaining nerve fibers. "This is revolutionary technology," the doctor explained, "but it's highly experimental." "So, I'm a guinea pig," John quipped, attempting to inject some levity into the heavy conversation. "In a way, yes," the doctor admitted with a small smile. "But on the bright side, what do you have to lose?" John chuckled dryly, turning the model over in his hands. "So, with this new eye, I won't be blind anymore, but I won't exactly see either." "We can't say for sure until after the procedure," the doctor replied. John's humor faded as he considered their words. He agreed to move forward, not for the sake of sight, but because he wasn't done with the world, not yet. When John finally re-entered society, the man who stepped out bore little resemblance to the one who had been torn apart. His face, crisscrossed with scars, was unrecognizable to anyone from his previous life. People avoided him, their gazes lingering briefly before darting away in discomfort. Though the doctors offered him plastic surgery, John refused. The scars were more than physical marks, they were a constant reminder of his hatred for Eleanor and Lenny. He wasn't finished with them, not by a long shot. On Friday, December 17, 2021, Jimmy Sims, known to most as Sweet Jimmy, sat at his vanity, meticulously applying his makeup. The soft strains of Aretha Franklin's Respect played in the background as he puckered his lips at his reflection. Jimmy hummed along, adjusting a small smudge in his mascara. Doing favors, darling, he purred, slipping into a pair of shimmering platform stilettos and fastening the straps. Come to the club on Friday night, and I'll make sure you get what you need. He blew a kiss at his reflection, winking before turning back to his brushes. As he leaned closer to fix his eyeliner, a movement caught his eye in the mirror. A figure stood in the shadows behind him, the room's dim light revealing only the edges of a dark hood. But why don't you tell me what you're really after, honey? Jimmy said smoothly, glancing at the stranger's reflection. The hooded figure stepped forward and pulled back the hood, revealing a face etched with scars. Jimmy's eyes widened in recognition as he turned to face the intruder. John, he whispered, his voice faltering. John's lifeless glass eye gleamed under the light as he held Jimmy's gaze. There was no humor, no warmth, only cold determination. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the club outside, but the tension in the room was palpable. Sweet Jimmy is on fire tonight, someone hollered from the hallway, pulling Jimmy's attention momentarily as they twirled away. Jimmy turned back to John, his polished demeanor cracking ever so slightly. Reaching for a cigarette, he held it up seductively, masking his unease. Do either of you boys have a light? He teased, his voice a shade more nervous than before. But John didn't move. His scars and silence spoke louder than words, the weight of his presence enough to make the air feel stifling. Jimmy purred, lighting his cigarette with a flick of his wrist as Polly and S followed him into the dimly lit lot. Growing impatient, the two men grumbled about getting their fun over with and heading back inside. The flicker of Jimmy's lighter briefly illuminated the group, casting shadows that stretched eerily across the cracked pavement. Well, an ominous voice interrupted. Jimmy froze, his bravado melting away. He nodded vigorously and scurried back into the bar without a word, leaving Polly and S behind. Polly awoke groggy and disoriented. The fresh scent of ocean air filled his nostrils, accompanied by the squawking of seagulls overhead. As his eyes adjusted, he realized he was seated on a cold wooden beam, his bare feet dangling into the seawater below. Across from him, S sat in the same position, his face pale and tense. Polly shifted, wincing as the sharp sting of barnacles scraped against his back. He was tied to a piling, the ropes biting into his skin, and a gag muffled his attempts to speak. As his senses cleared, Polly's gaze met S's, the shared horror of their predicament dawning between them. Their muffled cries filled the air, but neither could do more than exchange frantic, terrified looks. Well, I guess you can't tell me much with those gags on, a voice said cheerfully. Polly turned his head to see a scarred figure standing between them, holding up an old green wine bottle encrusted with barnacles. Don't you just hate littering? John said, grinning as he gestured to the barnacle-covered pilings towering around them. We can reuse so many things nowadays. Like this bottle, for instance. Without warning, he swung the bottle over S's head. S flinched as the glass shattered, shards falling into the water below. See, the ocean's great for cleaning things up, John continued conversationally, as if he were sharing a secret. But here's the thing, it's easy to bleed out. So, you've got to be careful. He glanced at their wrists, tied with rope. That string around your wrists? It makes a perfect tourniquet. Do you know what a tourniquet is? It's French for, well, I don't actually know. Don't ask me why. He shrugged casually. Anyway, John added with a grin, tie it tight below where you're cutting. That way, you won't bleed to death before you free yourself. Their horrified stares only seemed to amuse him further. See? No exsanguination. Pretty neat, huh? Later, in the private elevator of an upscale building, Lenny leaned back with an air of entitlement. The elevator stopped unexpectedly on the 5th floor, and a large man in a hoodie and sunglasses stepped in. This is a private elevator, Lenny snapped, glaring. Use the public one. The man silently held up a black access card, slid it into the VIP slot, and pressed a button for a lower floor. You've got a lot of nerve, Lenny growled, reaching out to grab the man's shoulder. He didn't expect the man to spin around, pressing the electrodes of a taser directly to his throat. Lenny woke groaning, his vision swimming. A figure stood over him, silhouetted against dim lighting. "Don't you remember me?" John asked cheerfully. "We were real close just a few months ago." A muffled whimper from behind drew Lenny's attention. He realized another body was pressed against his back. "Ellie, baby," he croaked. "Oh, isn't love grand?" John sang, yanking Lenny upright against the bulkhead. There, curled in a fetal position at his feet, was Eleanor. Her sobs filled the space, though she made no effort to meet Lenny's panicked gaze. "Come on, Ellie," John chided, his tone mocking. "Don't be a downer. Tell him the truth." Eleanor looked up, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes held no warmth. "I never loved you, Johnny," she murmured. "This was always about the money." John's grin widened. "Payback's a real pain, huh?" he said, gesturing around the small cruiser. "We're currently drifting off the Outer Banks. No one will miss this little boat." Reaching into a duffel bag, John pulled out 2 cinder blocks, setting one beside each of them. With deliberate care, he tied a block to their bound feet. "I've placed shaped charges all around the hull," John explained calmly. "Once I detonate them, the bottom of the boat will fall out, and you'll sink in seconds. No trace left behind." Hours later, as the darkness surrounded him on the ride back to shore, John felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of hope. A burden had been lifted from his soul, leaving space for something lighter. He glanced at the magazines Monique had left scattered in his cabin. They featured dark-eyed celebrities and male models with chiseled cheekbones. His prosthetic eye could be modified to match his real one, or so the experts had said. As sea spray hit his face, John sighed, closing his eyes for a moment. For the first time in years, the future felt open, like a horizon waiting to be claimed.